to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're talking with Rebecca Soffer, co-founder and CEO of Modern Loss, and co-author of a book by the same name. A bit later, we'll talk about how you can win a free copy of this inspiring and, yes, even humorous book. Welcome, Rebecca, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
So the New York Times hailed Modern Loss as a fresh, irreverent examination into navigating grief and the resilience in our time. Tell me a little bit about your journey, your life story, and how it got you to writing a book about grief and incorporating humor in that.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question because I don't think that everybody grows up and daydreams about starting a publication in a community focused on grief and loss. I think for the most part, people enter this kind of work and participate in these types of communities and missions based on personal experience. And I am no outlier to that. I am originally from Philadelphia. My mom and dad's names are Shelby and Ray, and I'm an only child, and I was incredibly close with them. I was 30 years old and working in political satire at the Colbert Report for Stephen Colbert in New York City, right after getting my graduate degree from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And while I was there, my mother was killed in a car accident when we came home from a vacation, a family camping trip in upstate New York. And this was on Labor Day in 2006. And, as so many listeners can, understand, all of a sudden my life was really split into the before and the after. And I didn't exactly know what that meant until the moment in which I was told that my mother had not survived a car accident. My father was in the car with her and did survive, but I found myself all of a sudden, from one second to the next, without the utterly foremost emotional anchor in my life. It felt like the foundational rug had been pulled out from underneath my feet, and suddenly I realized that I had to kind of navigate the entire world without her, and that loss was a forever thing, and that was something that I slowly realized. But as I headed back to work, eventually, after a week or so, it dawned on me, I was like, wow, this grief thing is really, it's going to be really hard because I'm 30, I'm single, I'm surrounded by other, single 30-year-olds, we're all working in comedy. My job is to come up with jokes. I feel like I want to die. And I also feel like not a lot of people around me can really empathize truly with what I'm going through. And I feel almost like an alien. And I remember thinking that I was embarrassed about it, because I didn't want to be seen as kind of pathetic or weak or unable to work, not a good producer, not a good journalist, not funny. But I was all those things. The thing is that I was also suddenly thrust into extremely profound grief. And that's a really weird time to start that experience because I wasn't a kid. I didn't have certain structures in place, that legally had to support me. And I wasn't a much older individual who probably was no stranger to loss and at least had a couple of friends or family members who they could talk to about it in a similar way. I was 30. I had to work all day long. I had to create space to move through grief, and it was very hard to find that time. And so I spent a lot of time searching for resources that could help me, in the middle of the night, because that's when I had free time. I didn't have free time at 2 p.m. I was working. And I found a lot online that were, they were kind of religious, or they were, incredibly earnest. And some of the elements were okay for me, or I found a lot of clinical sites on grief that were kind of medicalizing it. And the things that I was connecting to was whenever I would read an essay by somebody about, being in the grocery store and reaching for a bottle of syrup and suddenly being in a time machine and being with their person because that product reminded them of their person, or creating a new ritual on a birthday, coming up with something really creative, or anything that really was just like a human storytelling experience. That's what I found myself being comforted by. And it wasn't easy to find those things. They were kind of scattered throughout the internet or in publications. And I realized that as a journalist and as a producer and an editor and a storyteller, that is how I needed to connect with my grief and my loss, and by extension connect with others through storytelling, through honest storytelling that was raw and vulnerable and messy, because grief and loss is messy, and funny because life is ludicrous, death is ludicrous, and so grief has to be ludicrous too. And I wanted to be able to talk about the realness of it, because I found that as I started talking to different people about it in my real life, that's when I started really exhaling, realizing that I was not alone in this experience, and that even if somebody else didn't have exactly the same experience as me, they were struggling too, but they were also finding ways to be resilient too. And so I wanted to start a community where people could show each other through example, through their own stories, how we can live richly in the face of loss, not just like in spite of what you've gone through, but sometimes because of it. So that is what Modern Loss came out of, and I launched it with my friend Gabby Berkner in November 2013. It's an online publication. That's what it started out as, and very, very quickly grew into much more.
And you and Gabby bonded over, both of you suffered pretty devastating losses at a young age. And as you said, you were searching for resources, but everything seemed a little too clinical or patronizing, even a little cheesy, as you say.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to be assured that, your loved one is in a better place. We all have these, our standard cliche adages, and you weren't looking for, as you said, chicken soup metaphors. So You two came together and wrote this book along with, some 40 other contributors, and this community of individuals who contributed to this book. Why did you choose these people as your voice of modern loss?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Modern loss, there are a lot of wonderful grief memoirs out there. Everybody's heard of Joan Didion. We've all read the grief. C.S. Lewis, we all know that the people who have solo bylines, their memoirs. But modern loss was born out of the conviction that storytelling is a change agent and a community builder. And we are living in times that are so fraught right now. I do not have to go into why. We are very divisive. We are very isolated. And grief is one of the great universal levelers. We all are going to experience it. And so, by extension, if we share our stories about loss in ways that are really open and really out there and, like you say, are not cheesy, are not full of platitudes, assuring people that it takes a year or they're in a better place. It's okay if you believe that, but a lot of people don't. And so when somebody is assured of that, you can't really assume that, that's being received in a welcome way. I think that sharing stories is a way to assure people that they aren't alone. And I also think that sharing diverse stories helps people to get ideas that they might not have ordinarily thought of, maybe new coping mechanisms, maybe new creative rituals, maybe new ways to build community that this other person found that you hadn't thought of. It's like everybody, you don't have to be a therapist in grief to be a grief expert. You just need to be going through it to be an expert. And every single person's experience with grief is different. And so everybody is their own expert. And so Modern Loss was really created to for people to show their own expertise and pull each other through this experience. And so the book was very purposely created as a collection of essays for that very reason, to give people the opportunity to kind of get little windows into these very personal experiences of people that are so rarely, the curtain is so rarely pulled back. And we were very thoughtful about how we went about this process. As you said, there are more than 40 contributors. Many of them are very well known. We have Brian Stelter, who hosts Reliable Sources on CNN. We have Kim Goldman, who is well known in the sense that her brother Ron was murdered in the O.J. Simpson case. And we have Lucy Kalanithi, whose husband Paul wrote this gorgeous memoir, When Breath Becomes Air. We have well-known comedians and, human rights advocates and all that. But then we also have people who are a hairdresser in Worcester, Massachusetts, who no one knows her as a public figure, but her story is so compelling, and she has something to say, and people should read it. So we very purposely mixed these stories of kind of public figures with, just non-public figures to show that grief is universal. And it is a great leveler. And, this hairdresser could read this famous journalist's story, and they could resonate with each other, and they could form a connection. So that is why the book is put together like that. And we also wanted to make sure that it was warm and welcoming. Grief books can be very overwhelming. And we use, as you say, we kind of are allergic to platitudes. We use a heavy dose of levity whenever possible. Not to be disrespectful, nope, but because people are human and they need to be reminded that they're human. And grief is a forever thing. And if you're not allowed to laugh, that's going to be a really long life that you're leading that feels very austere and humorless. You need to be allowed to laugh at the ludicrous things that, crop up along the way because they're funny. And that's what makes it a human experience. And that's what allows you to connect with other people as well.
Right, and humor and grief don't normally go together in the same sentence. And The Strategist named this a best book on loss for a younger generation. What makes this modern? Why is it modern loss? Because it's so different from traditional grieving?
No, I get that question a lot, and a lot of our readership is on the younger side, 20s to 40s, very focused on building up their lives while suddenly navigating profound loss. That is just happenstance because I was 30 when my mom died. My dad died 4 years later when I was 34. Gabby was in her 20s when her stepfather and stepmother were killed in a home invasion. And so just by extension, a lot of our readership is younger. However, the modern of modern loss does not, it doesn't suggest a demographic. It doesn't suggest an age group. We have readers who are in their 80s. We have book contributors for this book who are in their 70s and 80s. The modern alludes to the mindset and the tone. The modernness of modern loss is, do you want to approach the topic and the experience of grief and loss in a way that is kind of out loud, not unfiltered. We're not asking you to post every single thing you're feeling on Facebook, but we're asking, does it kind of feel better to you to think about being able to talk about your experiences with loss, talk about your person with people around you, instead of feel like you can only talk about them in, say, a therapist's office or, a religious office or a clinical setting? Do you want to feel like you can bring your person and your loss into the rest of your life? And if so, that's going to make you feel so much more integrated, and it's going to make you feel so much more acknowledged in your loss, because it's really hard to heal without acknowledgement. And so we're trying to encourage people, you're going to feel acknowledged if you feel like more than one or two people are willing to hear about what you're going through. And chances are they are. And the more you talk about it in ways that feel comfortable to you, the more you're educating society about how to talk about grief and loss. And then you're creating this ripple effect where the next person might know how to support somebody else when they go through it, or they might get the support they need because we're all trying to educate people. Our society is very grief illiterate, and we want to make it grief literate. And the only way we can do it is by normalizing this conversation. There is no reason on earth that the most universal thing on the planet should be an abnormal thing to talk about.
Right, and as you said, each contribution in the book provides kind of a unique perspective on loss, as well as a remarkable life-affirming message. It's a beautiful message that you're not broken, life will go on, and it can actually be pretty rewarding. So talk about that, how our grief can actually be a rewarding experience.
Yeah, look, I am not a silver linings notebook kind of person. I'm not going to be the person who goes goes to your mom's funeral and says at the funeral, it gets better, or I promise you'll move, you'll get past this, or, I'm not going to be that person, because when you're in the thick of it, it's as though I would be speaking Klingon to you, because you're in those early days. That doesn't help you. You're like a little grief zygote. You're so raw and vulnerable, and you need to be handled in a way that is very, very gentle. But when we talk about living rewarding lives, yes, I mean, there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth. There is such a thing as resilience. And what modern loss and what I want to show people is that everybody has the capacity for resilience. And resilience is actually a muscle that can be atrophied if it's not practiced, and it can be strengthened if it is practiced. There are so many things that you can do to build resilience. There are so many practices that you can do for yourself. Self-care is such a generic term, but figuring out ways to resource yourself when you are really dealing with a difficult time is so integral. And even though you kind of deserve for the world to give you everything you need after a loved one dies, you deserve for your friends to automatically intuit that you need dinner, or that you need somebody to call you, or, you deserve for that to happen, or you deserve for your boss to say take a month off. But that's just not the way that it happens most of the time. It's not fair, but it's just not the way that it happens. And so that's why we talk about post-traumatic growth and resilience, because we all have agency within ourselves to figure out what we need. What kind of support do we need at the different stages of our loss? And when I say stages, I don't mean linear. I mean like wherever we find ourselves in this particular day. I need to find a good therapist? Do I need to figure out ways to have a more flexible work schedule? Do I need to go, eject a primal scream somewhere where nobody can hear me? Do I need to tell my friends that they're not being helpful when they keep asking me if I'm not over it yet? Think about what you need in that moment and figure out how to get it for yourself. That is what we mean, and that is how you can really build a rewarding and rich life in the face of grief and loss, because it's not all black and white. My parents died, both of them, by the time I was 34. I'd give anything to have them back. They never met my kids. But the reality is that they're dead. I don't have them, but I am very much alive, and I really owe it to myself to try and live as rewarding a life as possible, because not only do I know they would want that for me, but I want it for me because I'm here. Every single person deserves the opportunity to do that for themselves.
And it is such a roller coaster journey with grief. Like you said, it's not just a straight line, and people think, oh, this person's laughing, they must be over their grief, when that's not necessarily the truth. I mean, the humor might not only help us get over it, but honor our loved one. And I love how you do approach humor in the book, and even perhaps a form of therapy. For example, your grief speak section about some of the fun terms like clutter struck and sad booking. Talk about sad booking.
Yeah, sad booking. Oh, it's amazing. I do know that by heart because I have sad booked. It's, well, we came up with a bunch of terms that are, and I believe this whole excerpt ran as a full page in the New York Times because people really loved it. Because they loved it because it's true. It's a list of terms that you ordinarily would not hear in therapy because they're not therapeutic terms, but they're very real. And so sad booking is, I think we defined it as when you post something on Facebook and then you get really resentful when people aren't acknowledging it and liking it. And it's true, it's there have been moments over the years, I will admit, where maybe I'm feeling really, really low, and maybe I post a photo of my dad, and I'm just why aren't more people acknowledging this? Why why aren't they realizing that this photo symbolizes the fact that I'm really having a tough day? Why don't they realize? It's one of the pitfalls of social media. There's a lot of amazing things that online access can provide to us. One of the pitfalls is that when you don't feel seen, it can sting.
Right, right. And one of my other favorites is Clutter Struck, which is the inability to remove dead loved ones' seemingly meaningless items for fear that they might later prove to be surprisingly irreplaceable. And you have a picture of a receipt from Burger World.
Yes.
It's so true. It's like, oh, my mom touched that. I can't let that go. And, speaking of Facebook, that's an interesting, again, modern grief space, I think. We all do post, I've lost a loved one. And up until, I don't know if this is still true, but it seems that our loved ones who've passed, they still have a Facebook profile. And I still get a message that my friend's birthday is today and he died 10 years ago. Is this helping us to grieve? Is this just another outlet for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, with the Clutter Struck, that came from very personal experience. I must admit that even 14 years after my mom's death, I still have a piece of a Ziploc bag that has, on the label portion, it has Mom's Baked Chicken and the date. Because once I went through this awful breakup and I was so sad, and she called me from Philadelphia, which is my hometown, and said, I'm coming to New York and I'm bringing baked chicken. And she did, and it was delicious. And I found that, and I was like, I can never get rid of this bag. I'm just like, she wrote this. This is emblematic of her love. If I lose this, then I've lost her forever. And of course it's not true. A thing is just a thing. But there's no way that you can argue somebody out of the emotional connection that they have with these things. And so I'm a bit of a functional hoarder with some of these tiny little receipts and ephemera. And when it comes to Facebook, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. There's a lot of negative stuff online. There's a lot of easy ways to get pulled into conversations that are not going to help you. There's a lot of ways to feel terrible about yourself, but I'm going to spend a moment advocating for online communities in grief because that's what Modern Loss is, first and foremost. It's an online publication at its core, which publishes, narrowly focused personal essays around one aspect of the loss experience and advice columns and therapy columns and all that really great stuff. We also are very, very active all over social media, and what I have noticed through our public platforms and then our private groups is that these are so powerful. What they enable people to do is, in a very low-touch way, connect with this huge community of other people who get it, when they might ordinarily be surrounded by people who don't really, or people with whom they don't see eye to eye, or people with whom they don't feel like they can be very honest about talking about their person, maybe because they're in a community where, that person is very well known, or maybe they died in a way that was a little bit taboo or stigmatized. Maybe they feel like they're surrounded by friends who just don't want to listen. When you have online access to groups on grief online, you, with just one click, can expose yourself to a world of people who can offer different viewpoints to you, different ways in which they coped with regard to a similar problem you're having. They can offer you a little bit of suggested tough love. They can offer you different angles and religions and cultural suggestions that you might not have ordinarily had access to. And that is the power of meaningful and empathic online community. It's very, very powerful. And every single week through the Modern Loss channels, I will get a message saying how much somebody relies on what we do for their sanity at different points, because they know that there's somebody out there who wants to hear what they have to say.
And who gets it. And
who gets it, yeah.
And we talked about the platitudes. It seems that somebody announces, oh, my 89-year-old father passed away. And our typical response is, I'm so sorry for your loss. You're in my thoughts and prayers. Is it helpful just to see and hear those words? Or is there something a little deeper that we can say to our friends who announce their loss on social media?
Yeah, I think that, look, one of the best things that somebody ever said to me was, my mother died in a very traumatizing way for herself and for me. She died in a car accident, and I was in so much shock. I was in such utter shock. It was obviously very unexpected. And I got a lot of emails saying, we're praying for you, or I'm so sorry for your loss. And look, I know people are sorry for my loss. I don't mean to call it like it is, but of of course you're sorry for my loss. Unless you, absolutely hate me, I would assume that you'd be sorry for my loss. The things that really resonated with me were when, a good friend of mine emailed me telling me he had just heard the news and how unbelievably furious and upset he was. I mean, his fury and his anger and his sadness really jumped off the screen for me, and it was almost like exaggerated. He was like, I can't, this is the worst news ever. I'm so pissed off. He was like, Shelby was the best, and he was just so angry, and I was like, yes, because that's what I was feeling. I needed to know that somebody else was feeling something that I was feeling, even if it wasn't to that actual degree, that I was feeling it. I needed to know that somebody understood how scary this was, how infuriating, how sad, how terrifying, how life-altering it was that this amazing woman was suddenly no longer in my life and no longer alive. It really helped when people would say things like, my heart really is with yours, like some sort of solidarity, like some sort of I don't know the perfect thing to say, but I love you. I'm so sad this happened to you.
Just honesty, pure honesty.
Anything that kind of wasn't putting the pressure on me to give the perfect response. Whenever anybody asked, what can I do, I would not know what to say. I didn't know what I needed. But when someone would just say, I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm here for you, that really helped a lot.
Yeah, that understanding and affirmation are so important. I especially loved, going back to the humor aspect of it, the how-to cartoons by artist Peter Arkle. One of them that stuck out for me was Things to Know Before Scattering Ashes, something you don't talk about or think about. Talk about that section.
So when it comes to the piece about ashes, things to know before scattering ashes, does it sound morose to people who haven't had to scatter ashes? Maybe, yeah. Does it sound helpful to people who might need to scatter ashes? Absolutely. Does it sound resonant to people who have scattered ashes? 1,000,000%. That piece was written by Trey Miller Rodriguez, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's quite literally helpful. I did not know that I should stand, upwind in case the wind comes up and blows ashes in your face, in your lip gloss. I did not know that you needed to check legally to make sure that, you could have a permit to scatter these ashes. I had no idea because I've never had to do it. But I assure you, if I'm ever in this position, I know exactly what to keep in mind. And people are grateful for it. It's so much easier to put stuff out there. We're not hurting anybody by guiding somebody in how to scatter ashes. We're not hurting anybody by publishing a piece about what it's like to have a stillbirth. All we're doing is making people feel seen in that experience and assuring them that they're not alone. We don't mind taking on the seemingly public taboo type conversations at Modern Loss. And the reason is that just because you're not talking about something that is considered a stigma in polite conversation does not mean that it isn't a thing. We talk about all aspects of the underbelly of grief and loss at Modern Loss. Why? Because somebody has to. Somebody has to talk about stillbirth. Somebody has to talk about miscarriage. Somebody has to talk about what happens to your sex life after a loss, or your friendships, or your work drive. Somebody has to talk about this in very, very open ways, because everybody else who is going through something similar wishes that they would receive an invitation to talk about it. I promise you that. And so we start that conversation, and you see the gates burst open whenever we publish an article on jealousy after grief or friendship after loss. So many people comment saying, this happened to me, this is my experience. Grief and loss are messy, messy, messy things. And we want to address the mess of it. If you don't address the reality, which is the mess, you're simply not going to be really effective. It's like a nice little Band-Aid that's going to fall off after a couple of hours.
Very practical advice. Rebecca, I understand you have a second book coming out soon. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yes, I do. And it feels amazing to say that because it was fully written throughout the absolute depths of COVID-19 when I was really stuck at home with my two very small children and my husband over the last year and a half. It's called the Modern Loss Handbook. And it's an interactive guide to moving through grief and building your resilience. And that is to say that this is going to be a combination of me kind of like acting as your friend that's guiding you through various aspects of the grief experience and loss experience that are very targeted toward helping you find ways to stay connected with your person who you lost, stay connected with yourself, and stay connected with the outside world, because those are the three things that really lead to post-traumatic growth and finding meaning and living a resilient life. That's a lot of my own personal experiences. It's written in a very warm and chatty way, but it also has many, many exercises that are prompts, that are activities, that are suggestions that are rooted in therapeutic research, and I have a wide group of, therapy advisors behind me in this book. I'm going to help you think through friendships and intimate connections and work and, creating new rituals and meaning, and even some DIY like cathartic art therapy, which helped me and might help you. So I'm really excited about it. This is just authored by myself, and it was a really wonderful, meaningful challenge, and I'm curious to see what the world thinks of it. It's coming out in April 2022.
Wonderful. We will definitely look for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Modern Loss is a place to share the unspeakably taboo, unbelievably hilarious, and unexpectedly beautiful terrain of navigating your life after a death. Beginners are welcome. Rebecca, tell us who you're remembering today.
Well, today, as I do every day, I'm remembering my mom, Shelby Rosenberg, and my dad, Ray Rosenberg, who both died 4 years apart from each other. My very, very beloved parents. They were amazing, hilarious, supportive, witty, loving, kind, everybody's cheerleader. And, I do what I do with this work because of them, because they are no longer here. And because the hole that they left when their presence disappeared in my life was so great that I wanted to fill it with meaning. And this is part of how I am creating meaning in the wake of their deaths. And I'm doing it by promoting a very life-affirming project, which is helping people to live richly through their losses.
Rebecca Soffer, co-author of Modern Loss, co-creator of modernloss.com. Thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing your insight and your passion for this modern topic.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor.
And thank you for joining me today. To learn more about Modern Loss, visit modernloss.com. And to learn more about grief resources, visit rememberingalife.com. And for a chance to win a copy of Rebecca's book, Modern Loss, visit rememberingalife.com/giveaways.